The room held 30 men, and not one of them wanted to be the man who said what Corporal Daniel Kovac was about to say. He was 22 years old, the lowest rank in a space filled with colonels and majors, all of them staring at the same map, while General George S. Patton traced a route across it with one finger. Kovac had checked the numbers twice. Then he raised his hand. "Sir, I think the map is wrong." The silence that followed was the kind that falls over a room when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Colonels looked at the table, majors looked at the floor, and General Patton, commanding officer of the Third Army, a man not known for patience with correction, looked up from the map and across the room at the corporal standing near the back wall. He said nothing. What happened in the next 60 seconds would decide whether Daniel Kovac had just ended his career or saved it. And when the answer came, it was not the one anyone in that room expected. If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button before we go back to the beginning. To understand why Daniel Kovac said what he said, you first need to understand what a Third Army staff briefing actually was. It was not a seminar. It was not a discussion. It was information flowing up and orders flowing down, in a room where rank was the most visible thing about every man present, and where the distance between a corporal and a commanding general was not measured in feet, but in the entire organizational chart of the United States Army. France, 1944. The Third Army was moving faster than almost any American force had moved in the history of the war. The men who ran staff briefings were experienced officers who had earned their rank through campaigns and the accumulated weight of professional judgment. Colonels, majors, lieutenant colonels, men who had crossed beaches and buried friends and learned the hard way what it cost when a plan was wrong. Some of them, on this particular morning, had opinions about the map on the board in front of them. Some of them had looked at the same overlay the general was tracing and felt the same small unease that would soon put a young corporal's hand in the air. And every one of them had kept that unease to himself, because this was the Third Army, and this was Patton. General George S. Patton did not invite correction. He wore ivory-handled pistols. He drove through artillery range like the road owed him something. He commanded through force of personality as much as through doctrine, and a colonel who second-guessed him in front of 30 other officers was a colonel gambling with something he could not easily win back. The room itself seemed built to remind everyone in it of that fact. Maps covered every wall from waist height to ceiling, overlapping sheets of acetate marked in grease pencil. The air carried the smell of cigarette smoke, diesel fumes drifting in from the vehicles parked outside, and the particular staleness of canvas that had not been dry in days. Nobody sat. Nobody leaned against the wall. Every man in that room stood the way men stand when they are being watched by someone whose opinion of them could end their careers before lunch. That was the room Daniel Kovac stood in, at the very back, near the wall, in a position nobody would later be entirely sure how to describe. He was attached loosely to the G2 section, working with the map team because someone had needed a spare set of hands. 22 years old, the lowest rank present by a wide margin, and about to become the only person in that room willing to say a sentence that could not be unsaid. Kovac had grown up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the oldest son of a Hungarian immigrant who had come to the United States before the First World War and spent 2 decades learning the exact weight of American steel inside a mill that never seemed to stop breathing smoke into the sky. His father was a large, quiet man who understood something he had passed on to his son without ever quite saying it in words, that a trade carried in the mind cannot be taken away from you the way a job can be taken away, the way a mill can close, the way a country can turn on the people who built it. So he had pushed his son toward drafting and survey work, toward something that lived in the head rather than in the back. Daniel Kovac had spent nearly a year working field survey for a civil engineering firm before his draft notice arrived. A year of checking maps against the actual ground beneath his boots. A year of learning that what a map says and what the earth says are 2 separate statements, and that only one of them is ever true. He had a younger brother named Thomas, still finishing school back home, and a girl named Helen, who worked behind a counter at a downtown department store and wrote him letters about everything except the war, which was exactly what he wanted from her letters. He had bought a ring off another soldier who needed the cash more than he needed a promise, and he kept it wrapped in a scrap of cloth at the bottom of his kit. He had a plan, a practical, unromantic plan for after all of this was finished. Finish his surveying certification, find steady work with the county, ask Helen a particular question the day he got home. He was not a dreamer. He was the kind of man who looked at a map and saw exactly what was actually there. Nothing more and nothing less. And it was that habit, more than anything else, that put him in the back of that briefing room on this particular morning, with his eyes narrowing at a junction that did not look right. The Third Army's success in the summer and fall of 1944 was built on a foundation that rarely made it into the newsreels. The dramatic river crossings, the long, fast marches, the sheer speed of the advance across France, all of that sat on top of something far less glamorous, the accuracy of the planning underneath it. A wrong road could delay an entire division by hours. A misjudged bridge rating could strand armor on the wrong side of a river with the enemy closing in. A map error inside a staff briefing was never an academic problem. It was a potential catastrophe measured out in fuel, in time, and at the far end of the arithmetic, in the lives of men who had no choice but to trust that the information handed down to them was correct. And the overlay Patton was tracing that morning had something wrong with it. The junction he placed his finger on sat, according to the map, on a road running through the edge of a small French town the Third Army intended to pass through within the next 2 days. But the town's road network had been rebuilt in the years before the war, after damage from flooding, and the cartographic information behind this particular overlay predated that rebuilding by the better part of a decade. The actual junction sat roughly 1.5 miles to the southwest of where the map placed it. On paper, a small distance for a mechanized column moving at speed through terrain its drivers had never seen before. It was the difference between arriving on schedule and arriving 3 hours late. The difference between a coordinated advance and a line of vehicles stacking up on a road that did not connect to anything they had been briefed to expect. Kovac knew this because the survey work he had done before the war had run directly through towns like this one, through the kind of administrative paperwork that documented exactly when and how local roads had changed. It was not common knowledge. It was the particular narrow kind of knowledge that only comes from standing on actual ground with a transit and a notebook, checking what the paper says against what your own eyes tell you, until the gap between those two things becomes the only thing you are trained to look for. He had recognized the error almost immediately after the overlay went up on the board. He had run the calculation twice in his head, the way his father had taught him to check a number before he ever said it out loud. He had waited, the way anyone in his position would wait, to see if someone with more rank and more standing in that room would say something first. A colonel near the front was looking at that exact stretch of the map with an expression Kovac recognized. The particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he does not like the answer to. The colonel said nothing. A major with direct operational responsibility for that stretch of road glanced at it, glanced away, and said nothing either. Patton kept talking, his finger moving steadily along a route that Kovac now knew, with a certainty that made his stomach tight, was wrong. 30 men stood in that room. Kovac stood at the back of it, in a uniform that marked him as the least important person present, holding a piece of information that every officer with more authority than him had apparently decided was not worth the risk of speaking. His palms were damp. His heartbeat had climbed into his throat, loud enough that he wondered, absurdly, if the man standing next to him could hear it. He thought about Helen's letters. He thought about the ring wrapped in cloth at the bottom of his kit. He thought, oddly, about his father standing at the mouth of a furnace, a man who had never once in his life pretended a piece of steel was something other than what it actually was, because pretending was how men got hurt. He thought about what it would mean to stay silent, to let the column roll toward a junction that did not exist, where the map said it did, and to know, for the rest of his life, that he had watched it happen and said nothing. Patton's finger reached the junction on the overlay and tapped it once, describing, in that clipped and certain voice of his, exactly what the Third Army was going to do with that road in the next 48 hours. Daniel Kovac raised his hand. The room did not go quiet immediately. It took a half-second for 30 men to register that the hand belonged to the corporal at the back, that a voice from the lowest rank present was about to interrupt a commanding general mid-sentence, that something was happening in this briefing that did not happen in briefings like this one. And then Kovac spoke, in a voice that was steadier than he felt. "Sir, I think the map is wrong." The silence that followed was not the ordinary silence of a room waiting for a briefing to continue. It was the specific, complete silence of a room in which something has just been said that cannot be taken back, no matter what happens next. Colonel Slocum, down at the table in front of them, and the majors, found something urgent to examine on the floor. The aide standing nearest to Patton appeared, in the space of about 2 seconds, to reconsider the entire architecture of his career, and to be grateful, for possibly the first time in his life, that it was not his voice that had just filled that silence. And General George S. Patton, commanding officer of the Third Army, lifted his eyes from the map and looked across the room at the 22-year-old corporal standing near the back wall. He did not say a word. The silence stretched long enough that it stopped feeling like silence and started feeling like a held breath shared by 30 men at once. Patton did not blink. He did not reach for his pistols. He did not raise his voice. He did none of the things every man in that room half expected him to do. He simply looked at the corporal in the back of the room the way he might look at an unfamiliar stretch of terrain, reading it, taking its measure before deciding what to do with it. Then he said 2 words, in the clipped, flat voice he used when he was not performing for an audience. "Show me." For a moment, Kovac did not move, because some part of his mind did not fully believe those words were an invitation rather than the opening line of a court-martial. Then he stepped away from the wall and started forward, past a colonel who did not meet his eyes, past a major who shifted his weight as though to make room for something he did not want standing next to him, until he reached the map table and stood beside the commanding general of the Third Army, with 30 pairs of eyes fixed on the back of his neck. Up close, the overlay looked exactly as it had from the back of the room, a web of grease pencil lines over a printed base map, dates and unit symbols crowding the margins. Kovac put his finger on the junction Patton had been tracing a moment earlier. "This junction, see it. The map shows it here, on the north side of the town, where this road meets the highway. But the actual junction isn't there anymore. It's about 1.5 miles to the southwest." Patton's eyes narrowed slightly. "Go on." "The town rebuilt this section of road years before the war, after flood damage took out the old crossing. The new junction was relocated to higher ground. This base map is drawn from survey data that predates that reconstruction. Whoever compiled this overlay was working from an older source, without knowing the road had moved." He kept his voice level, the way he had learned to keep it level standing over a transit in a field outside Pittsburgh, reporting numbers to a foreman who did not care about his opinion, only about whether his numbers were correct. He did not apologize for speaking. He did not hedge. He said what needed to be said, and then he stopped talking, because he had learned that the surest way to undercut a correct answer was to keep talking past the point where it had already been proven. Patton did not look at Kovac while he spoke. He looked at the map, following the corporal's finger to the junction, then out to the surrounding terrain features drawn around it, the elevation lines, the tributary marked in blue, the notation in the bottom corner of the overlay indicating the source and date of the cartographic survey it had been built from. He was quiet for perhaps 10 seconds, an eternity in a room where every other man had stopped breathing at a normal rate. Then he leaned in, close enough to read the small print in the corner of the sheet, and straightened up. The room had gone so still that the sound of Patton's boots shifting against the floorboards seemed unnaturally loud. Nobody moved. Nobody dared clear his throat. A staff briefing that a moment earlier had been proceeding at the clipped, forward momentum of a general describing an operation was now suspended entirely, waiting on the verdict of a man who had built an entire reputation on never admitting he needed to check his own work in front of subordinates. For a moment, nobody in that room was thinking about grease pencils or overlays. They were thinking about what 1.5 miles looks like when it is not a line on paper, but an actual stretch of French countryside. Hedgerows and drainage ditches and narrow farm lanes never built to carry armor. They were picturing tanks and half-tracks and fuel trucks strung out nose to tail, rolling toward a junction that existed only on a sheet of acetate, arriving to find a farmhouse and an empty field where a road was supposed to meet a highway. They were picturing the radio traffic that would follow, confused, escalating. Company commanders trying to explain to battalion why the column had stopped moving. Battalion trying to explain to regiment. Someone eventually unfolding a map and tracing the same line Patton had just traced, and finding the same gap between paper and ground that Kovac had already found, except finding it hours too late, in the dark, with fuel gauges dropping and a schedule already collapsing behind them. Nobody said any of this out loud. Nobody needed to. Every officer in that room had served long enough to picture it without being told, and that private, silent calculation was very likely part of why the room stayed as still as it did while Patton studied the map. "He's right," Patton said. He did not say it loudly. He did not turn to address the room. He did not scan the faces of the colonels and majors who had looked at that same stretch of map and said nothing. He said it the way a man states an observed fact, without inflection, without drama, the same tone he might have used to note that it looked like rain. And this is the part of the story that tends to get lost in the retellings, because it is less dramatic than the moment before it, and drama is what people remember. What Patton did in the 30 seconds after confirming Kovac was right tells you more about how the Third Army actually functioned than almost anything else that happened that morning. He did not make a scene of the error. He did not turn on his staff and demand to know why a room full of experienced officers had missed something a corporal caught in 15 minutes. He did not single out the colonel who had been staring at that exact junction with visible unease and say nothing about it. He simply had the overlay corrected right there, in grease pencil, with Kovac indicating the precise coordinates, while an aide made the notation. The route was adjusted. The briefing continued exactly where it had left off, as though the interruption had been a scheduled part of the agenda rather than a 22-year-old corporal contradicting a 4-star general in front of his entire staff. Less than 5 minutes had passed from the moment Kovac raised his hand to the moment Patton's finger was moving across the corrected map, continuing the briefing without a hitch in his voice. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what the alternative cultures look like, because Patton had seen them, and so had every officer serving under him, whether they could name what they were seeing or not. There is a particular failure mode that develops inside any hierarchy where information only travels safely in one direction, upward, filtered through what a subordinate believes his superior wants to hear, downward, as orders that are not supposed to be questioned. Officers who understand that correcting the man above them carries real professional risk, and that staying silent carries no risk at all beyond the private discomfort of watching an error unfold, will learn, over time, to stay silent. It does not require cowardice. It only requires an accurate read of incentives. A command staffed entirely with men who have made that calculation produces something dangerous precisely because it looks, from the outside, indistinguishable from a well-run operation. Meetings proceed smoothly. Nobody interrupts. The general's plan meets no resistance in the room, and the general begins to mistake the absence of resistance for the presence of accuracy. He starts, without realizing it, operating on a map of his own certainty, rather than a map of the actual ground his men will have to cross. Patton understood this better than almost any commander in the European theater, not because he was a gentle listener. He was not, and there are plenty of documented moments where his temper produced exactly the opposite of what happened in that briefing room. But because he had watched other commands rot from the inside out, under the weight of comfortable silence, he needed his maps to be right. More than that, he needed the men around him to believe, all the way down to the lowest rank in the room, that telling him a map was wrong would not end a career. Without that belief, sooner or later, someone was going to watch a column drive toward a junction that did not exist and say nothing, because saying something had never once been rewarded. There's a reason military historians, looking back at failed campaigns in any army, in any war, so often find the same pattern buried underneath the tactical explanations. It is rarely a single catastrophic decision that sinks an operation. More often, it is a long chain of small silences. A lieutenant who noticed a supply estimate looked optimistic and decided it was not his place to say so. A captain who suspected a reconnaissance report was thin but did not want to be the one who delayed an attack by questioning it. A colonel who saw exactly what Kovac saw and filed the doubt away instead of raising his hand. Each individual silence looks reasonable in isolation. Stacked together, across an entire staff, they produce a command that believes things about the battlefield that are simply not true, and believes them with total confidence, because nobody in the room ever told it otherwise. What happened in that briefing tent was Patton, whether he thought of it in these terms or not, refusing to let that pattern take root in his own headquarters, and doing it in the one currency that every soldier in that theater understood without needing it explained to him. A stripe on a sleeve, awarded within a day, with no ceremony and no ambiguity about what it was for. For the rest of that morning's briefing, nothing more was said about the correction, but word of what had happened moved through the encampment with the particular speed that only stories involving a general's mistake can move. By early afternoon, men who had not been anywhere near that room could describe the moment in detail, most of it accurate, some of it already beginning to drift, the way stories do when they pass from mouth to mouth. Some of the reactions were admiring. A private in the motor pool, hearing the story secondhand from a friend who had been on guard outside the briefing tent, said the kid had more nerve than half the officers in the division, and he was probably not wrong. Other reactions were less generous. One of the colonels who had stared at that exact junction and said nothing spent the rest of the day short-tempered with his own staff, and nobody who worked under him needed to ask why. Discomfort has a way of finding somewhere to go, and it rarely goes toward the person who caused it. A sergeant from the motor pool, a heavy-set man named Wallace, who had known Kovac since basic training and considered himself entitled to say things other men only thought, cornered him near the mess line that evening and told him flatly that he must have a death wish, correcting a 4-star general over a road nobody else in that tent had the nerve to mention. Kovac shrugged and said the road was wrong whether anyone mentioned it or not. Wallace laughed, not because it was funny, but because there was nothing else to do with the tension of imagining what could have gone differently. Other conversations that evening were quieter, held in the low voices men use when they suspect they're about to say something that reflects poorly on themselves. More than one officer who had been in that room found a reason to avoid the mess tent altogether that night, eating alone or skipping the meal, unwilling to sit across from men who had watched the same silence settle over him that had settled over everyone else. Kovac himself did not linger on any of it. He went back to the map tables that afternoon and did what he had been doing before the briefing, checking coordinates, cross-referencing overlays, running the same quiet calculations he had been running since long before the army had given him a uniform. He did not celebrate. He did not seek out the colonel whose silence had nearly let the error stand, and he did not avoid him either. He simply worked, the way he had always worked, because as far as he was concerned, the correction had already happened. The overlay had already been fixed, and there was nothing left to discuss. Somewhere behind him, in a tent lit by a single hanging bulb, men with far more authority than he had were still turning the morning over in conversation, trying to decide exactly what they had watched happen, and what, if anything, it was supposed to mean for the way they ran their own sections. Kovac did not know that conversation was happening. He would not have cared much if he had. He had a map in front of him, and a stack of overlays still waiting to be checked against it. And that, as far as he was concerned, was the whole of his job that evening. In a part of the process that no one in the briefing room witnessed, the paperwork moved. Whether Patton signed it himself that night, or simply gave the order and let his staff handle the mechanics of it, is impossible to say for certain. What is clear is that by the time the sun rose the next morning, Corporal Daniel Kovac had already become, on paper, something else entirely. There was no formation called to announce it, no ceremony, no gathering of the unit to watch a new stripe pinned to a sleeve in front of an audience. That was not how it happened, and in its own way, the absence of ceremony said as much about Patton's intentions as a speech would have. This was not a public reward designed to make an example of anyone. It was simply a correction, applied as cleanly and as quietly as the correction to the map itself had been applied the day before. The man who delivered the news was Sergeant First Class Roy Engel, who had been standing near the side wall of the briefing room the previous morning and had said almost nothing to anyone for the rest of that day. Engel had spent nearly 2 decades in the army by then, long enough to have seen most of what a headquarters could produce in the way of surprises, and this one still seemed to be settling into him as he crossed the tent toward the map tables in the grey light just after sunrise. He found Kovac already at work, bent over an overlay with a grease pencil in hand, and stood there a moment before speaking, the way a man stands when he is still deciding how he feels about the news he is about to deliver. He held out a small paper with the orders typed across it, and told him, in a voice that seemed to be working out its own opinion on the matter as it spoke, that he was now a sergeant. There was no smile on Engel's face when he said it, and no disapproval either, only the particular, careful blankness of an experienced, non-commissioned officer who understood that something unusual had just happened in his headquarters, and had not yet decided whether unusual, in this case, meant good. Kovac read the paper twice, the way he read everything twice, and looked up at Engel with an expression that was harder to interpret than the words that followed. His first question was not about the promotion at all. Was the route corrected on the operational overlay? Engel blinked. Then he told him it had been. Kovac nodded, folded the paper, and put it in his pocket, and went back to the maps in front of him, because the maps were still there, and there was still work to do, and a stripe on his sleeve did not change the fact that the Third Army was moving again in a matter of hours, and needed the ground beneath it described correctly. Engel stood there a second longer than he needed to, watching the newly promoted sergeant return to a grease pencil and a stack of overlays as though nothing at all had changed. Then he shook his head slightly, in the way of a man filing away a story he suspected he would be telling for the rest of his life, and went to find the next name on his list of morning business. What Patton had promoted, in the end, was not map knowledge. Map knowledge, on its own, is a qualification, something you can train into almost anyone with enough time and a good enough instructor. What he had put a stripe on was something considerably rarer and considerably harder to produce through training alone: the willingness to be right out loud, in a room full of men who outranked him, at the exact moment when the cost of speaking was impossible to calculate in advance, and the cost of staying silent would have been paid entirely by someone else. Men in vehicles on a road that did not go where the map said it did. An army built on comfortable silence is an army with a reliability problem. It cannot see from the inside. When the only information reaching a commanding general has already been filtered through what his staff believes he wants to hear, that general stops operating on a map of the actual terrain in front of him and starts operating on a map of his own preferences, dressed up to look like intelligence. The Third Army moved the way it moved across France that year, and through the difficult winter fighting that followed, and into Germany the following spring, in part because Patton had built, whether by deliberate design or by instinct sharpened over decades of command, an environment where accurate information carried more weight than comfortable information, even when that accuracy came from the lowest-ranking man in the room. He was not a patient man. He was not, by most accounts, a particularly gentle one, and there is no shortage of documented moments where the same temper that made him fearsome to serve under produced outcomes very different from what happened in that briefing tent. But the instinct that produced Daniel Kovac's promotion was cut from the same cloth as the instinct that produced the Third Army's operational record. He needed the ground truth. He needed men willing to hand it to him even when it contradicted what he had just said out loud in front of an audience. And when a 22-year-old corporal demonstrated exactly that, in front of 30 officers who had, every one of them, chosen the safer path, Patton recognized precisely what he was looking at, and he did not wait until the following week to act on it. None of this made Kovac popular in every corner of that headquarters, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. A story like his tends to flatten, over the years, into something simpler than it actually was. A young hero, rewarded for courage, a wise general recognizing talent, a clean moral lesson with no rough edges. The truth sitting underneath it was messier. Some officers admired what he had done and said so openly. Others resented it quietly, not because they doubted the correction was accurate, but because a corporal's promotion for speaking out of turn was, to men who had spent years learning exactly when speaking out of turn was permitted, an uncomfortable data point. It suggested that the rules they had spent their careers mastering were less fixed than they had believed, that judgment could sometimes outrank rank itself, and that was not a comfortable thing for every man in that headquarters to sit with, regardless of how correct the underlying map had turned out to be. The briefing room was reset within the hour. New overlays went up on the boards. The old ones were folded away and filed, and the Third Army moved the way it always moved, forward, at speed, without spending much time looking back at the rooms it had already left behind. Whatever the men who had stood silent in that tent felt about what they had witnessed, they carried it with them into the next briefing, and the one after that, and history does not record whether any of them ever raised a hand of their own in the months that followed. What can be said is that the standard had been set in a way words alone could never have set it. A corporal had spoken, had been right, and had been rewarded within a day, in front of witnesses who would carry that fact with them for the rest of the war, whether they discussed it openly or not. Sergeant Daniel Kovac stayed with the map section through the difficult months that followed, through the fall push and the brutal winter fighting, and into the final campaign across Germany the following spring. He was not the subject of another dramatic story that anyone bothered to write down. He checked overlays, he cross-referenced coordinates, he did the same quiet, unglamorous work he had been doing since before the army ever gave him a uniform, and he did it exactly as carefully after the promotion as he had before it, because carefulness, for a man like Kovac, was never about who was watching. Whether the correction he introduced into that single briefing saved fuel, or hours, or something that resists being measured at all, is not an arithmetic anyone can perform with certainty. You cannot count the cost of a disaster that never happened. What can be said is this: a column that was headed toward a junction that did not exist, where the map said it did, drove instead toward the junction that was actually there. Somewhere in that difference sits an amount of time and fuel, and possibly lives, that nobody will ever be able to calculate, because the entire value of the correction is defined by the disaster it prevented from happening in the first place. When the war in Europe ended, Kovac went home to Pittsburgh, back to the survey work he had left half-finished when his draft notice arrived. Back to a girl named Helen, who had spent 2 years writing him letters about everything except the war, exactly as he had wanted. He finished the certification his father had pushed him toward years earlier. He found work with the county engineering department, the same practical, unromantic plan he had carried in his kit, alongside a ring wrapped in cloth. He asked Helen the question he had been carrying across an ocean and back, and she did not make him wait long for the answer. Whatever else the war had given or taken from him, it had not changed the fundamental habit that had put him in the back of that briefing room in the first place. The simple, stubborn insistence on checking what the paper says against what is actually there, and saying so when the two did not match. He raised a family in the years that followed, worked the same steady job for decades, and rarely brought up what had happened in that briefing tent, unless someone else asked first. It was not modesty exactly, or not only modesty, it was the same instinct that had kept his voice level while he explained the discrepancy on the map to a 4-star general. The event had a beginning, a correction, and an end, and once the overlay was fixed, as far as he was concerned, there was nothing left in it worth dwelling on. The story of that morning followed him anyway, in the way stories do among men who served together, told at reunions and in letters for decades afterward, gaining detail in some tellings and losing it in others, the way any story does when it survives mostly by word of mouth rather than official record. But the core of it never changed, because the core of it was simple enough that it did not need embellishing. A corporal saw an error. Everyone with more rank than him saw it too, or close enough to it, and said nothing. He said something, and the general everyone in that theater feared more than they feared the enemy chose, in that specific moment, to reward the truth over the silence. That choice raises a question that people who study command culture have never fully agreed on, and it is worth sitting with rather than resolving too quickly, because both sides of it are held by serious people for serious reasons. One argument says Patton made a mistake that morning, not in correcting the map, but in how publicly and how quickly he rewarded the man who corrected it. An army runs on discipline, and discipline depends on predictable structures of authority. If a corporal can interrupt a 4-star general in front of his entire staff and walk away promoted for it, what signal does that send to every other corporal in the theater who believes he knows better than the officers above him? Some of them will be right, the way Kovac was right. Many of them will not be. And an army that teaches its lowest ranks that confidence and correctness are the same thing, that speaking up always carries a reward and rarely carries a cost, is an army inviting a different kind of chaos, one where authority erodes, not through open rebellion, but through 1,000 small challenges from men who are usually, but not always, wrong. The other argument says the opposite, and says it just as forcefully. An army that punishes accuracy in order to protect the comfort of rank is an army that will, sooner or later, follow a confident commander down a road that does not go where the map says it does, and it will follow him there precisely because every man capable of stopping it learned, long before that moment arrived, that stopping it was not worth the risk to his own career. What Patton did in that tent, the argument goes, was not a threat to discipline at all. It was the most operationally important decision he made that entire week, because it told every man under his command, from the newest private to the most senior colonel, that the map mattered more than the man holding the pointer, and that when those two things came into conflict, the map would win every time, regardless of who was holding it or who was contradicting it. Both of these arguments describe a real tension that has never fully gone away in any military structure, in any era, in any country. Discipline requires predictable authority. Accuracy requires the freedom to challenge that authority when the ground truth demands it. An organization that leans too far toward the first produces officers who cannot be corrected even when they are catastrophically wrong. An organization that leans too far toward the second produces a structure that cannot function under pressure, because everyone believes his own judgment outranks the plan. What happened in that briefing tent in France did not resolve that tension. Nothing resolves it permanently, because it is not the kind of problem that stays solved. It simply showed, for one specific morning, what it looked like when a commander who understood both sides of that tension chose, in a single fast decision, made under the eyes of 30 subordinates, to come down on the side of the map. It is worth noticing, too, what Patton did not do, because the omissions in that morning's response say almost as much as the promotion itself. He did not open the door to every corporal in his command, second-guessing every officer above him on every subject. He rewarded a specific, narrow kind of correctness, a verifiable technical fact, checked against evidence Kovac could point to and explain in plain language. Not an opinion, not a hunch, not a disagreement about strategy or judgment. The distinction matters, because an army that rewards any subordinate who feels confident enough to interrupt his superiors is a very different thing from an army that rewards a subordinate who can demonstrate, with evidence, that the ground does not match the map. Patton's decision that morning was narrower and more disciplined than it might first appear, which may be part of why it worked as well as it did, and why it did not produce a wave of undisciplined corporals interrupting briefings across the rest of the theater. Daniel Kovac never claimed to have thought through any of that in the moment he raised his hand. In the moment itself, he was not thinking about discipline or command culture or what his decision might signal to anyone else in that tent. He was thinking about 1.5 miles of French road and a column that was going to drive toward a junction that was not where the map said it was, and the simple, uncomfortable fact that he was the only person in that room who seemed to know it. So the question is worth asking honestly, without pretending there is an easy answer waiting at the bottom of it. Was General George S. Patton right to promote a corporal for correcting him in front of his entire staff? Or did that decision plant the seed of a different kind of problem, one that simply never happened to sprout on this particular occasion? What do you think would have happened in your own unit, under your own command, if the lowest-ranking man in the room turned out to be the only one willing to say the map was wrong? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you want more untold stories from World War II, the kind that never made it into the textbooks, make sure you are subscribed, because there are a great many more of them still waiting to be told.